The first sound wasn't barking. It was something closer to a scream. Coda never made that sound. Not once in the 4 years Ethan had known him, not during thunderstorms, not when the coyotes came close to the tree line, not even the night the generator caught fire and the whole back corner of the property lit up orange against the snow. But at 2:17 in the morning, during the worst storm the mountain had seen since February, Coda stood at the back door and screamed. Ethan came down the stairs in socked feet, heart already ahead of his body. The door handle was ice cold. When he pulled it open, the wind hit him like something with a grudge. Snow was coming sideways. The lantern above the woodpile swung hard on its hook, throwing shadows that moved like living things. Coda shot through the gap before Ethan could grab his collar, a flash of silver and white already dissolving into the dark. Ethan pulled on his boots without lacing them. He didn't think, he just followed. The woodpile sat about 30 feet behind the cabin, stacked under a cedar overhang that kept the worst of the weather off. Ethan had built it himself, 2 summers after Sarah died, when he needed something to do with his hands and his grief at the same time. He found Coda there, pressed against the bottom row of logs, curved into a shape Ethan didn't immediately understand. He had to get closer before he saw it. Curled into the space between Coda's chest and his front legs, barely visible, soaked completely through, trembling so hard the movement looked almost mechanical, was what appeared to be a small cat. Ethan stood there for a moment in the blowing snow, and just looked. The animal wasn't moving on its own, but it was breathing. He could see that much from where he stood, the faint, rapid flutter of its sides. Coda looked up at Ethan with an expression he had no good word for, not pleading exactly, more like, "I found this, do something." Ethan crouched down in the snow and reached toward the animal. His hand stopped about 6 inches away. The kitten, if that's what it was, opened its eyes, gold, almost amber, and in the lantern light, briefly, strangely luminous, it hissed. A sound completely out of proportion to its size, raw and warning and wild. Then it pressed itself tighter against Coda's chest. Ethan sat back on his heels. The cold was soaking through his jeans at the knees. The snow was still coming. The lantern above him swung. Something about the animal felt wrong, or not wrong exactly, but off. The fur was too thick for how small it was, dense and layered in a way that reminded him of an Arctic bird. The ears were small and rounded and set far apart on a wide, flat face. The paws, tucked now under its body, had looked enormous when it had shifted, disproportionate, like a kitten still growing into its own feet. He had found strays before, twice in the years on the mountain. Both times they had been immediately, desperately friendly, pressing into his hands with that particular starved affection that domestic cats default to when they're scared enough. This was not that. This animal was frightened and furious and wild in a way that didn't fit the shape of something that had once belonged to someone. He got them both inside. Coda walked in calmly. The kitten came because it refused to be separated from Coda, following at his heel like a small shadow, flattening against the baseboard the moment they crossed the threshold, scanning the ceiling and the corners with those wide amber eyes. Ethan built the fire up. He set a towel near the hearth, not close enough to frighten the animal, just close enough that the warmth would reach it, and then he stepped back and let Coda handle the rest. It took about 20 minutes. Coda lay down beside the hearth, and the kitten spent the first 5 watching him from the corner. Then it crept forward, one careful paw at a time, and pressed itself flat against Coda's ribs. It shook for a while, then it didn't. Ethan sat in the chair by the fire with a cup of coffee he'd made mostly to have something to do with his hands, and he watched the two of them sleep. Coda's breathing was slow and steady. The kitten rose and fell with it. "What are you?" Ethan thought. Not out loud, but he thought it. He'd lived on this mountain for 6 years. He knew the animals, bobcats, lynx, the occasional cougar moving through higher up. He knew what the strays from the valley looked like. He knew what feral cats looked like when they'd been outside long enough to go half wild. This wasn't any of those things. Over the next few days, the animal, Ethan started calling him Milo on the second morning, quietly, without explanation, would eat only if Coda was present, would move through the cabin like something performing a security sweep, checking corners, mapping exits, would growl at his own reflection in the bathroom mirror with complete seriousness, would sleep only on top of Coda, or beneath his chin, or wedged between his paws. And every evening, around the same hour, Milo would climb up onto the back of the couch nearest the window and sit perfectly still, staring into the forest, just staring, like he was waiting for something to come out. When Ethan sent the photos to the wildlife rehabilitator 2 towns over, he expected her to respond with something about domestic breeds, or maybe a mix he hadn't considered. Instead, she called him. She didn't say hello. She said, "Where exactly did you find this animal?" Ethan described the woodpile, the storm, the sound Coda had made. There was a pause on the line. "That's not a stray cat," she said. Her voice had dropped, careful and strange. "That's a palace's cat, a manannual. They're not supposed to be anywhere near here." Ethan looked across the cabin to where Milo had climbed directly onto Coda's head and fallen asleep, one enormous paw draped over the husky's ear. "What does that mean?" Ethan asked. Another pause. "It means," she said slowly, "that he didn't come from nowhere. And wherever he came from, something out there may still be looking for him." That night, Ethan lay awake and listened to the forest. For the first time in years, it didn't feel empty. The wild cats were gone before Ethan reached the tree line. He stood at the edge of the porch in the dark, boots unlaced again, breath coming out in short white clouds. The flashlight swept the snow. Nothing, just the tree line, still and black, and the faint impression of shapes that might have been shadows or might have been something else entirely. Coda stood beside him, nose low, reading something in the cold air that Ethan couldn't access. Milo was already back inside. Ethan went in after him and stood in the doorway for a long moment before he shut out the cold. The tracks were there in the morning, not one set, several, circling the perimeter of the property in a wide, unhurried arc, pausing at the woodpile, pausing near the back steps, pausing outside the window where Milo spent his evenings watching. Ethan crouched over them in the early light with a coffee mug warming both hands and studied the shape of the prints, round, compact, the front feet slightly larger than the rear, the way cat prints always were, but bigger than any domestic cat had a right to be, and pressed deep, deliberately, with the particular evenness of something that knew exactly how to move through snow without disturbing it unnecessarily. Something had come close, had looked, and had chosen not to announce itself. He didn't mention it to anyone. Milo was changing. It happened slowly enough that Ethan almost missed it. The animal that had arrived trembling against Coda's ribs, light as a wet paper bag, was filling out now into something that moved differently. The wide, flat face had settled into a look of permanent, alert composure. The enormous paws made sense now. The body was catching up. The fur had dried into layers of thick silver gray that rippled when he moved, like winter grass in wind. He still refused human contact. If Ethan extended a hand, Milo would stare at it with the particular expression of someone being offered something they find faintly insulting. He didn't hiss anymore. He simply declined. But Coda remained the exception to every rule. Milo ate beside him, slept on him, followed him through the cabin with the serious, proprietary air of a junior partner. When Coda went outside, Milo went to the window. When Coda came back in, Milo met him at the door with what Ethan could only describe as a debrief, sniffing Coda's muzzle and ears and paws with methodical thoroughness, reading wherever the husky had been. And Coda, for his part, had reorganized his entire life around a 12-pound wild cat without any visible complaint. The escorting started in the 3rd week. Milo had begun venturing outside, brief trips at first, just to the edge of the porch, then farther. He hunted with a focus and economy that was striking to watch. No play in it, no performance, just the long ground-level stalk, the stillness that lasted longer than seemed possible, and then the sudden explosive compression of distance. He was very good at it. But whenever Milo moved more than 30 feet from the cabin, Coda went with him, not chasing, not herding. Walking ahead, slightly to the left, pausing at intervals to check the tree line before moving again. The practiced, deliberate movement of something that had appointed itself to a job and took the job seriously. Coda swept the perimeter while Milo hunted, stood between Milo and the direction of any unfamiliar sound. Once, when a coyote appeared at the edge of the property, thin and yellow-eyed, testing the air, Coda placed himself in front of Milo without being asked, and didn't move until the coyote decided it had somewhere else to be. Milo watched the whole exchange from directly behind Coda's left hind leg. When the coyote was gone, he walked forward and sat beside the husky for a moment in the snow, not touching, just present. Then he turned and walked back toward the cabin. Ethan had watched it from the window. He stood there for a long time after, his coffee going cold in his hand. He followed them one morning in early March. He hadn't planned to. He'd been watching Milo and Coda disappear into the tree line the way they had started doing every few days. Coda breaking trail through the deeper snow while Milo moved behind him, and something about the direction they took had started to seem less random than it first appeared. Always the same bearing, always toward the same cluster of fallen trees on the north slope, where a logging road had washed out years ago. He gave them a 10-minute head start. Then he pulled on his heavy coat and went after them. The snow was lighter under the canopy. The tracks were easy to follow. He moved slowly, staying in the broken trail Coda had left, watching where he put his feet. He heard them before he saw them. Not Coda. Coda moved silently when he chose to, but the others, small, quick sounds in the snow. The kind of sounds a litter of young animals makes when they don't yet know to be quiet. Ethan stopped behind a spruce and looked through the branches. Beneath the collapsed overhang of a fallen cedar, the root ball lifted and the trunk angled against a standing tree, creating a low, dry cave of sorts. There were animals moving, small ones, round-faced, thick-furred, stumbling over each other with the cheerful incompetence of the very young. Palace's cat kittens, 4 of them, maybe 5. Difficult to count, the way they kept rearranging. Coda sat in the snow a few feet away, watching them with the patient, slightly worried expression he usually reserved for Milo doing something inadvisable. Milo was in the middle of them, being climbed on, and then the adult stepped out of the shadows, larger than Milo, a female, moving with the deliberate economy of an animal that had been doing this a long time. She came forward without hesitation, crossing the space between the den and Coda in a straight line that should have been aggressive and wasn't. She stopped 2 feet from the husky. She looked at him. Coda looked back, and then she turned around and walked back to her kittens. Ethan stood completely still behind the spruce for a long time. His eyes were burning, and it took him a moment to realize why. The gift started the following week. Ethan found the first one on the back step, a rabbit, recently caught, placed neatly beside the door with the precision of something that had thought about where to put it. He stood over it for a moment with a confused kind of reverence. The next morning it was feathers. A bird's wing, still mostly intact, set at the threshold. The morning after that, the remains of something small and carefully arranged, left in the same spot. He mentioned it to the wildlife rehabilitator, Margaret. He'd started thinking of her by name when she called to check in. She was quiet for a moment after he described it. "She's paying a debt," Margaret said finally. "That's what it looks like anyway. Offering food. It's not a behavior I'd expect toward a dog. But if she's connected the husky to the survival of her kitten," she paused again. "Animals don't always do what we expect them to do." Ethan looked out the window at the tree line. "No," he said quietly, "they don't." He stopped counting the days that felt different from the ones before. There were too many of them now. Evenings he sat by the fire and listened to sounds in the yard that were no longer just wind. Mornings he found tracks he'd started to recognize the way you recognize handwriting. The cabin that had been so comprehensively, structurally silent for 3 years had become something he didn't have a word for yet. Not full exactly, but inhabited in a new way, occupied, attended to. He thought about Sarah sometimes, watching Milo watch the forest. About the particular things she'd found funny, the specific way she'd laughed. He thought about her without the usual flinching now, the grief still there but somehow no longer the heaviest thing in the room. He hadn't noticed when that changed. The shots came on a Thursday evening. He heard them from inside, too, distant but distinct, from the direction of the old logging road on the north ridge. Coda was on his feet before Ethan had fully registered what he'd heard. Milo dropped from the back of the couch to the floor in one fluid motion and stood there rigid, ears flattened, every line of his body changed. Ethan crossed to the window. The tree line was dark and still. Then Coda hit the back door hard, scratching, urgent. Ethan opened it. Coda was gone before it was fully open, a gray shape swallowed almost instantly by the dark between the trees. Milo stood in the doorway for 3 seconds, looking out into the dark. Then he looked back at Ethan once, a direct, measuring look. Then he followed Coda into the trees. Ethan grabbed his coat. He was running before he understood he was running. The forest at night in March is a different place than it is by day. The snow muffles sound unevenly. Some things become louder, others disappear entirely. He followed the tracks by flashlight, moving faster than was smart, branches catching at his jacket and releasing. He heard Coda before he saw anything, not screaming this time, something lower. A sustained, resonant sound that Ethan felt more in his chest than his ears, a warning directed at something ahead, past the fallen cedar, past the den. He came through the trees and stopped. The kittens were gone, retreated deep into the overhang, he assumed. The female was there, pressed flat against the cedar trunk, utterly still. Beside her, one of the other adults, male, bigger, sat hunched with one foreleg held slightly off the ground, favoring it. Coda stood between them and the direction of the sound. He was not backing down. Ethan looked past him into the dark and saw the flashlight beams moving through the trees on the ridge above, 2 of them, maybe 3, sweeping methodically downslope. He stood very still and thought about what he had: a hurt wild cat he couldn't touch, a litter of kittens, a husky who had decided this was his family, and a hillside full of hunters who had apparently heard about something unusual in these woods. The flashlight beams were getting closer, and Milo was sitting directly beside the injured male, pressed against his shoulder, with an expression that Ethan recognized from the woodpile 6 weeks ago. "I found this. Do something." Ethan turned off his flashlight. He stepped forward into the dark. He spent the next 2 hours working by feel and memory, blocking the lower trail access where it crossed his property line, moving carefully through the dark, getting between the searchers and the ridge above the den site, without confrontation, without announcement. He called Margaret from the tree line, whispering. She called the Wildlife Authority. The Wildlife Authority called someone else. By the time first light came gray and thin over the ridge, the other flashlights were gone. The forest was quiet again. Ethan sat in the snow with his back against a pine tree, breathing hard, and let his heart rate come down. From somewhere above him in the timber, he heard the low sound of kittens rearranging in their den. Coda came and lay down beside him without ceremony, heavy and warm against his left side. They sat there together in the early light, and neither of them said anything. Then came morning. Ethan woke in the cabin after 2 hours of restless sleep to Coda standing at the back door again, not screaming this time, not even whining, just standing, looking at the door with a focused, patient intensity that Ethan had come to understand meant something specific. He got up. He opened the door. The porch was empty. The yard was empty. Milo's blanket near the hearth was empty. He checked the forest edge. He checked the woodpile. He walked the perimeter of the property with Coda trailing him, nose working constantly, until they had covered every inch of it. Milo was gone, not out hunting, not at the den site, gone. Coda sat down in the snow in the middle of the yard and looked at Ethan with an expression that was the saddest thing Ethan had ever seen on an animal's face. And this time he didn't come back by nightfall. The search, 3 days. That's how long Ethan told himself to wait before he let himself believe something was wrong. He was past 3 days now. He stood at the back window in the early morning of the 5th day and watched Coda do the thing he'd been doing since Milo disappeared, walking the same loop around the property, nose low, pausing at the same spots, circling back. He had done it 6 times already this morning, maybe 7. Ethan had stopped counting. The husky wasn't searching anymore. He was hoping. There's a difference, and Ethan knew it, and watching it was difficult in a way he hadn't prepared himself for. Coda stopped eating on the 2nd day, not entirely. He'd take a few bites if Ethan sat beside him and waited, but the enthusiasm was gone, that particular husky energy that had always made feeding time feel like a minor celebration. Now he ate the way you do when someone reminds you that you should, not because you're hungry. He slept at the edge of the forest, not inside it, just at the very last place where the cabin's shadow reached the tree line, as if he was trying to maintain contact with both things at once. By the 4th morning, Ethan had found him there twice before dawn, curled into himself in the snow, nose pointed toward the dark between the trees. He'd brought a blanket out the 2nd time, set it beside Coda without a word. The husky had looked at it, then looked at Ethan, then put his chin down on his paws. Ethan had sat with him for a while in the cold. Neither of them went back inside until it was light. The guilt arrived on day 3 and didn't leave. It was specific and methodical, the way real guilt usually is, not a general feeling but a series of particular decisions, reviewed one at a time. He should have been more careful about the hunting rumors. Margaret had warned him, weeks ago, that word moved fast in small mountain towns. A rare animal, an unusual sighting. People talked, and he had listened and nodded and then done almost nothing, because things had felt settled, felt safe, felt like the kind of quiet that lasts. He should have contacted the Wildlife Authority sooner, not at midnight in the middle of a crisis. Weeks ago, calmly during daylight, with time to do it properly. He should never have let the manuals feel this was safe territory, the bitter version of himself said, late on the 4th night. You made them comfortable, you brought them close, and then you couldn't protect them. He knew that version was wrong. He also couldn't quite make it stop talking. Margaret drove up on the afternoon of the 5th day. She hadn't called ahead. She just pulled her truck into the drive and got out with a thermos and the careful expression of someone who has delivered difficult news before and has gotten no better at it. They sat on the porch steps and she asked him to walk her through every detail he could remember from the night of the gunshots. He did. She listened without interrupting, occasionally writing something in a small notebook. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. The shots were likely further off than they sounded, she said finally. Sound carries strangely off the ridge at night, and there were no reports of anything taken. I checked. Ethan nodded. That doesn't tell us where he is, he said. No, she agreed. It doesn't. She looked out at the tree line. Coda hasn't found a scent trail going in a bad direction. Coda, Ethan said, has been walking the same loop for 5 days. She looked at the Husky, out at the property edge, doing exactly that. He's not looking, she said quietly. No, he's waiting. Ethan looked down at his coffee cup. Yeah, he said. That's what I think too. On the 6th night, Ethan couldn't sleep. He came downstairs at midnight and built the fire up, more for the light than the warmth, and sat in the chair he'd been sitting in since January, and looked at the empty space near the hearth where Milo's blanket still was. He hadn't moved the blanket. He wasn't sure what that said about him. He thought about the first night, the lantern swinging above the woodpile, the shape of Coda curved protectively around something small and drenched and furious in the snow. He thought about those amber eyes opening in the dark and the hiss that was so much larger than the animal that made it. He thought about Milo on the back of the couch, evening after evening, watching the forest with that particular quality of attention that wasn't quite patience and wasn't quite anticipation, something between the two, something that had known all along that there was something out there, something that had been watching back. He was still sitting there when the first gray light came through the window. He almost missed the tracks. He'd been out with Coda for the morning loop, their version of it, which had none of Coda's quiet anguish and all of Ethan's, spread across a wider search pattern that he knew rationally was probably pointless and did anyway. They were coming back along the south side of the cabin when Coda stopped. Not dramatically, just stopped walking. Ethan stopped too. The Husky's nose was working. Then his tail moved, one slow sweep, uncertain, and then another, quicker. Ethan followed the dog's line of sight down to the snow beside the porch steps. Prints, small, round, the familiar pattern of a Pallas's cat mid-stride, the slight unevenness of the front paws larger than the rear. Not old prints. The edges were still sharp, undisturbed by wind. Made sometime in the hours before dawn, while Ethan had been sitting inside staring at an empty blanket. He crouched over them. Not one set, many. They covered the porch approach and wrapped around the base of the steps and spread out across the yard in several directions, a confusion of overlapping trails that spoke of more than one animal, moving without any particular urgency, taking their time. Something had come to the cabin in the night. Something had stood outside while he sat inside, and something had left again before morning. He looked at Coda. Coda was already looking at the tree line. The wait after that was the hardest kind, the kind where you have evidence of something but not the thing itself, where hope has returned but hasn't resolved into anything you can hold. Ethan spent the afternoon doing small tasks near the cabin, chopping wood that didn't urgently need chopping, checking things that didn't urgently need checking, staying close, being findable. Coda stationed himself at the forest edge and didn't move. The afternoon light dropped and the temperature dropped with it, and Ethan built the fire up again and left the back door slightly open and sat where he could see both the fire and the door at the same time. He didn't sleep. The sky was just beginning to color at the edges, that particular shade of pre-dawn blue that exists for about 20 minutes before it becomes something else, when he heard Coda. Not the crisis sound, not the sustained warning from the ridge above the den, something quieter than that. A single sound, repeated, that Ethan had only heard a handful of times in 4 years. The sound Coda made when something he recognized came toward him from a distance. Ethan was at the back door before the thought was finished. The yard was dim and still. At the tree line, Coda was standing. And out of the dark between the trees, moving through the snow with his familiar ground-level deliberateness, came Milo. Bigger than when he'd left. Something in the way he moved had settled and solidified. The last adolescent uncertainty gone, replaced by something more decided. He crossed the yard without hesitation, came to Coda, pressed his forehead briefly against the Husky's jaw. Coda made the sound again, lower this time. Ethan stood in the doorway and watched, and didn't say anything, and breathed. Then Milo turned. He looked back toward the tree line, and the forest moved. They came the way the snow comes when the wind drops, all at once and quietly, without announcement. The female first, stepping from the shadow of the nearest pine into the gray light, with the measured confidence Ethan had come to recognize. Behind her the kittens, all 5 of them, larger now, moving with more coordination than they'd had at the den. The injured male, the one who had favored his foreleg in the dark above the ridge, walking evenly now on all 4 feet. And 2 others Ethan hadn't seen clearly before, adults, flanking the group with the instinctive positioning of animals that understood how a perimeter works. They crossed the yard in the early light, and arranged themselves around Coda with the naturalness of something that had been decided before tonight. Not fearful, not cautious, simply present. The female walked forward and touched her nose briefly to Coda's muzzle. The kittens climbed on him without apology. The injured male settled into the snow a few feet away, close enough to be inside the group, and blinked slowly at nothing. Coda stood in the middle of it and looked at Ethan across the yard with the particular expression of a dog who has decided that he has been correct about something all along. Ethan's throat tightened. He sat down on the porch steps and watched the light come up over the ridge and just let the moment be what it was. He should have known it wouldn't hold. He had perhaps 20 minutes of it, the pale morning light, the sounds of kittens in the snow, Milo perched on Coda's back with his tail wrapped neatly around his own feet like something carved, before Coda's head came up. The husky went still in a specific way. The kittens felt it and went still too, following his lead with the automatic responsiveness of animals who have learned that if the large, trustworthy creature stops moving, you stop moving too. Then Ethan heard it, voices, faint but distinct, coming from the direction of the logging road on the north ridge, the particular cadence of people moving through terrain with a purpose. The Manals panicked silently, no sound, just the sudden compression of 7 animals becoming very small and very flat within the space of a breath. Milo dropped from Coda's back to the ground and looked at the husky, and Coda moved. What happened in the next hour was something Ethan could not have designed if he had tried. The husky led them, there was no other word for it. Moving along a route that stayed below the ridgeline, using the terrain the way something born to winter moves through it, efficiently, without waste, the Manals followed with a trust that should not, by any measurable logic, have been available to them. The female ran tight to his left flank. The kittens clustered in the middle, the adults flanked. Ethan moved parallel to them on the outer edge, working by phone, calling Margaret, calling the wildlife number she'd given him, reading coordinates off the map application with hands that weren't quite steady. It took time. Voices moved on the ridge above them, flashlight beams appeared and disappeared through the trees. Once, close enough that Ethan could hear specific words, a pair of figures came within 100 feet of the group before changing direction for reasons that had nothing to do with what was below them in the snow. Ethan didn't breathe for approximately 90 seconds. Coda didn't move. The kittens didn't make a sound. By mid-morning the ridge was quiet. By noon, Margaret had 2 wildlife officers on the logging road and the access had been formally flagged. By mid-afternoon Ethan was back at the cabin, sitting on the porch steps in the thin winter sunlight, feeling the specific exhaustion of a body that has been operating on adrenaline for longer than it should. Milo sat beside him on the step, not touching, but beside him. It was the closest the animal had ever voluntarily positioned himself to Ethan, and Ethan did not move or reach toward him or make anything of it. He just sat there, and Milo sat there, and the afternoon light moved across the yard. Coda was at the tree line again, not waiting this time, just watching, the easy proprietary watching of something that has decided the territory is secure and is simply confirming that assessment. The snow came in the late afternoon, heavy, steady, the kind that settles into every surface and softens every edge and makes the world smaller and quieter. Ethan built the fire up. He made dinner he was too tired to taste. He sat in his chair. He thought about calling his brother, who had been asking him to come back to the city for 3 years now, asking with increasing gentleness, the way you ask someone who you're worried is disappearing. He thought about what he would say. "I'm okay. I think I'm actually okay now. I know that sounds..." He didn't finish the thought. He sat with the fire, and outside the snow kept coming, and somewhere in the white dark beyond the window, Coda was still keeping watch. And then the sound came. One shot, close, from up the ridge. And Coda disappeared into the trees. Ethan stood up from his chair. He stood completely still for a moment, listening to the silence the shot had left behind. Then he put on his coat. The guardian of the wild pack. He ran, not carefully this time. Not following tracks by flashlight with any particular method or patience, just ran, into the dark, into the snow that was still coming down in the thick, unhurried way it had been all evening, calling Koda's name with a voice that didn't sound like his own. The forest swallowed the sound the moment it left him. He pushed through the first stand of pines and out onto the slope above the cabin, sweeping the flashlight in wide arcs. Nothing. The beam caught snowflakes and tree trunks and the blue shadows between them and nothing else. He moved upslope, following the angle of the ridge, because that was the direction the shot had come from, and the direction Koda had gone, and there was no other information available to him. Milo appeared at his left heel. Ethan hadn't heard him come. He was simply there, moving through the snow with his low, ground-covering stride, slightly ahead now, angling upslope with a purpose that looked less like following and more like leading. Ethan followed him. They moved through the timber for what felt like a long time. The snow was deep on the upper slope and Ethan's thighs burned with it. Milo moved through it differently, that dense winter coat doing what it was built for, the wide paws distributing weight across the surface in a way that kept him from punching through the crust the way Ethan did with every step. Twice Ethan lost sight of him and found him again only because the animal paused, turned back, waited with visible impatience before moving on. He thought, "You came back into those woods for Koda. You led your family across that ridge for Koda," he thought. "You're doing it again now." He heard the husky before he saw him, that low, resonant sound again, the one that lived in the chest more than the ears, sustained and deliberate, pitched to carry exactly as far as it needed to, and not farther. Ethan oriented on it and pushed through a stand of young spruce, branches dumping cold loads of snow down the back of his collar, and came out into a small clearing on the upper slope. Koda was there, standing, uninjured. Between the husky and the far edge of the clearing, a man Ethan didn't recognize stood holding a flashlight and looking at Koda with the expression of someone who has had a plan interrupted by something they weren't expecting. He was alone. His flashlight was pointed at the ground now. His other hand was empty. Koda had not moved. The man looked at Ethan. Ethan looked at the man. Neither of them said anything for a moment. "Your dog?" the man said finally. "Yes." He came out of nowhere. The man gestured vaguely at the trees. I didn't see anything. I heard something on the ridge and fired wide, just to clear the area." A pause. "I didn't hit anything." Ethan looked at Koda. Koda looked at Ethan. Some wordless confirmation passed between them. "This is posted land," Ethan said. His voice was level, up to the ridge line. The man looked at his flashlight. Then he looked back at Ethan. "I didn't know that. Now you do." It took another 20 minutes to get the man back to the lower trail, and pointed toward the logging road. He went without argument, which Ethan was grateful for, because he wasn't certain what he would have done if there had been an argument. He was operating on fumes and cold air and the sustained anxiety of the last hour, and none of those things made for reliable decision-making. He stood at the property boundary and watched the man's flashlight move away through the trees until it disappeared. Then he turned around. Koda was sitting in the snow behind him. Milo was sitting beside Koda. They were both looking at Ethan with the patient expression of creatures who have been waiting for him to finish his business so they can go home. He laughed. It came out rougher than expected, more release than amusement, but it was real. He stood in the dark on the upper slope in the falling snow, and laughed, and Koda's tail moved once against the snow, and Milo stared at him with the serene incomprehension of a wild animal watching a human do something inexplicable. Then all three of them turned and walked back down toward the cabin. They came out of the tree line into the yard and stopped. The Manils were there. All of them, the female, the kittens, the recovered male, the two flanking adults, arranged across the yard in the falling snow, with the unhurried composure of animals who had been waiting and knew they had time. The female sat closest to the cabin steps. The kittens were less composed, tumbling over each other in the accumulating snow with the irrepressible energy of young things who cannot maintain gravity for long. When Koda came through the tree line, the female rose. She crossed the yard to him, directly, without the careful approach she had used in the early weeks, and pressed her forehead against his jaw the way Milo had done when he'd come back from the forest. The husky stood still and let her. One of the kittens climbed onto his back and immediately fell off the other side. Ethan stood at the edge of the yard and watched and felt something in his chest that he didn't try to name. He sat down in the snow, not on the steps, not on the porch. In the yard, in the falling snow, in the middle of it. His knees hit the ground first, and then he just sat there, and Coda came and pressed against him, all of him, that full-body husky lean that meant something Ethan had come to understand over 4 years of quiet winters together. "You're still here. I'm still here. We're okay." Milo climbed onto Coda's back and sat there, tail wrapped around his feet, looking out at the yard with the expression of a small creature who has decided he is very large. Around them the snow kept falling. The kittens eventually calmed and settled into a pile near the porch steps. The adults arranged themselves at the yard's perimeter with the natural, unstudied positioning of animals that have learned what a safe space looks like and how to hold it. Ethan sat in the middle of it all and let his breathing slow. He thought about Sarah. He did this sometimes still, not with the old flinching avoidance, not with the weight that had made thinking about her feel like pressing on a bruise, but openly, the way you think about someone who is part of you. He thought about what she would have made of this, of him, sitting in the snow in the dark in the middle of a collection of wild cats and a husky, 3 years on the other side of the worst thing that had ever happened to him, crying a little and not particularly minding. She would have laughed first, then she would have sat down beside him. Spring came the way it always did on the mountain, reluctantly, in stages, with several false starts that dropped 8 inches of snow in April just to remind everyone what the previous 5 months had been. But it came. The logging road was formally closed to recreational access in late February, the paperwork moving faster than Ethan had expected once Margaret applied her particular brand of organized persistence to the process. 2 trail cameras went up on the North Ridge, motion activated, monitored remotely by the Wildlife Service. The Manuel family appeared on them regularly, the female, the kittens growing visibly between one check and the next, the adults moving through the same routes in the same sequences that suggested settled, established territory. No one came up the road. The mountain was quiet. The kittens grew. This happened faster than seemed possible. The stumbling, climbed over creatures from the den becoming, over the course of weeks, something more deliberate and self-possessed. They hunted with increasing competence. They moved through the property with the ease of animals that had grown up knowing a place, knowing its angles and its smells and which trees meant shelter and which clearings caught the afternoon light. They still climbed on Coda. This did not diminish with age in any meaningful way. If anything, it became more deliberate, as if it had graduated from instinct into preference. Ethan would look out the back window on a March afternoon and find the husky lying in a patch of sunlight on the south side of the cabin, with 2 half-grown manuals arranged across him like weather, and Coda wearing the expression of someone who has made his peace with his circumstances and found them acceptable. Milo continued to sleep inside. This had apparently been decided at some point without Ethan's input, and he had no objection. The animal still refused direct contact, would not be touched, would not be picked up, maintained a personal perimeter of approximately 2 feet that communicated itself clearly without any drama. But he slept near the hearth. He ate in the kitchen. He occupied the cabin with the easy authority of something that has determined its status and sees no reason to keep discussing it. Some evenings he sat beside Ethan's chair, not touching, just beside him. Ethan had learned not to make much of it. That was the wrong approach with Milo. Any acknowledgement was received as an imposition. You simply sat, and the animal simply sat, and the fire did what fire does, and that was enough. It was more than enough. Margaret came for dinner in April, on a Thursday evening when the snow had finally receded below the cabin level and the air carried the first tentative warmth of the coming season. She stood on the back porch after they'd eaten and looked out at the yard where Coda was making his evening rounds, 2 of the young manuals trailing behind him with the proprietary confidence of animals who have decided they are assisting rather than following. "How are you doing?" she said. Not as a pleasantry, as a real question. Ethan thought about it. "Better," he said. "Actually better. Not the version of better where you're managing something. The other kind." She looked at him. "That's good," she said simply. They stood on the porch in the early evening and watched Coda lead his small procession along the property edge, checking the corners, confirming the perimeter, doing the thing he had apparently decided was his work and would continue to be his work for as long as the work needed doing. "He's something else," Margaret said. "Yeah," Ethan said. "He always was." The calls from his brother became easier, not because anything was explained. Ethan never quite found the way to describe what the winter had been, and eventually stopped trying. But the quality of the silence on his end of the line changed, and his brother heard it, the way people who know you hear the things you're not saying. "You sound different," his brother said one evening in March. "Good different or bad different?" A pause. "Like yourself," his brother said. "Like how you used to sound." Ethan looked across the cabin to where Milo was sitting in the window, watching the last of the day's light leave the ridge. "Yeah," he said, "I think that's about right." On a morning in early May, Ethan opened the back door and stopped. The porch was covered in tracks. Husky prints and manual prints, and the smaller, sharper prints of kittens, overlapping and circling each other in the patterns of animals that had moved through the same space at the same time, without any particular agenda. And in the far corner of the porch, tucked against the wall where the morning sun hit first and held longest, 3 of the young manuals were asleep in a pile, pressed together with the unself-conscious completeness of creatures that feel safe. Coda was lying beside them. He looked up when Ethan opened the door. His tail moved against the porch boards. Milo appeared at Ethan's ankle, came from inside, where he'd been, and stepped out onto the porch and surveyed the scene with the air of a senior official confirming that everything is in order. Then he stepped over 2 of the sleeping kittens, found a square of sunlight at the porch's edge, and sat down in it. Ethan leaned against the doorframe. The mountain was bright with early light. A breeze moved through the pines on the ridge and brought the particular cold, clean smell of snowmelt and pine and turned earth that meant the season was finally changing for real this time. He thought, 3 years ago I came here because I had nowhere else to go. Because this was the place we'd planned to come together, and coming here alone was the closest I could get to not being alone. He thought, I don't know what it looks like from the outside. A man and a dog and a wild cat and a family of animals that have no particular reason to trust anything and have chosen to anyway. He thought, I know what it looks like from the inside. He went in and put coffee on. When he came back to the door with his mug, nothing had moved. Coda was still there. The kittens were still there. Milo was still in his square of sunlight, eyes half closed, tail wrapped around his feet, watching the ridge with the patient attention of something that knows exactly where it is and has decided this is the right place to be. The lonely silence that had lived in this cabin for 3 years was gone, not replaced by noise, not replaced by anything loud or dramatic or sudden, just gone. The way grief goes when something finally grows up through it, quietly and over time, and so gradually you almost miss the moment it happened, but it happened. Outside, the mountain held its breath in the early light. And on the porch of a cabin that had been silent too long, a husky and a wild manual and 3 sleeping kittens kept watch over a man who had finally, in the strangest and most unexpected way, found his way back to something like home.